The airport was buzzing with travelers, each one lost in their own world. Some rushing to catch flights, others waiting in long security lines, and a few simply sitting quietly, watching the movement around them. Among the crowd, a police officer walked briskly, his uniform crisp, his eyes scanning the luggage moving through the security checkpoint. At his side trotted a well-trained police dog, a German shepherd named Max. His nose twitched as he sniffed the air, trained to detect anything suspicious. Max had done this routine 100 times before. He knew the scent of danger, the trace of illegal substances, the faint whiff of something that didn't belong. But today something was different. As he moved past a line of suitcases neatly stacked near the baggage claim, he suddenly stopped. His ears perked up, his body stiffened, and a low growl rumbled in his throat. The officer holding his leash frowned. "What is it, boy?" he muttered under his breath. Max didn't move. His eyes were locked onto a particular suitcase, a large black one with worn-out edges. Then, without warning, he lunged forward and sank his teeth into the side of the suitcase. A few startled gasps came from nearby passengers. "Sir, is everything okay?" a security officer called out, stepping forward. The police officer tugged at Max's leash, but the dog refused to let go. He growled again, his powerful jaws locked onto the suitcase as if he were trying to pull something out of it. It wasn't drugs. Max had never reacted like this before. It was something else, something far worse. By now, a few passengers had stopped to watch. Murmurs filled the air. A man in a business suit, clearly the owner of the suitcase, stepped forward hesitantly. He looked nervous, his fingers twitching as he adjusted his tie. That's my bag," he said, forcing a laugh. "There must be some mistake." The officer looked at the man carefully. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step aside while we inspect your luggage." The man's face paled. "Oh, come on, this is ridiculous. It's just my clothes and some personal items." But Max wouldn't let go. He tugged at the suitcase again, his teeth scraping against the fabric. Then something strange happened. A faint, almost inaudible sound came from inside the suitcase. A sound that sent a chill down the officer's spine. It was a muffled noise. Sound like a whisper. The officer felt his heartbeat quicken. He exchanged a glance with his partner, who had just arrived at the scene. The second officer knelt beside the suitcase and pressed his ear against it, listening carefully. There it was again. A soft, barely noticeable movement from inside. The owner of the suitcase took a step back. I need to catch my flight," he stammered. "I don't have time for this." But the officers weren't listening anymore. They were focused entirely on the suitcase. Slowly, carefully, they reached down and unzipped it. The moment the zipper moved, Max released his grip and took a step back. His ears flattened against his head. A tense silence fell over the area as the suitcase was opened just a few inches. And then something inside shifted. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The officer pulled the zipper down a little more, just enough to get a better look. And that's when they saw it. A single wide-open eye staring back at them from the darkness of the suitcase. The owner of the bag turned and ran. Max barked. The officers lunged after the man. The crowd erupted in chaos. But the real horror was still inside the suitcase. The moment the suitcase was unzipped just enough to reveal that staring eye, everything around the baggage claim area seemed to slow down. The air felt heavier, thick with an eerie stillness. People who had been watching from a distance suddenly stepped back, unsure of what they had just witnessed. The officer nearest to the bag swallowed hard, his hands gripping the edges of the suitcase as if afraid to open it further. The man who had claimed the suitcase was already running, pushing past confused travelers, his footsteps loud against the polished airport floor. "Stop him!" one of the officers shouted, snapping out of his shock. Another officer, positioned near the exit, immediately took off after the man. Max barked sharply, pulling against his leash, eager to chase, but his handler held him back. Right now, they needed to focus on what was inside that bag. The officer hesitated before pulling the zipper down further. The suitcase opened wider, revealing something no one expected. A face, pale, frightened, and barely able to move, peered out from inside. It was a young woman. Her eyes were wide with terror, her lips slightly parted as if she wanted to scream but couldn't. Gasps rippled through the gathering crowd. A woman standing nearby covered her mouth with her hands, and a man whispered under his breath, "Oh my God!" The officer immediately bent down, speaking in a calm voice. "Ma'am, can you hear me? Are you hurt?" The woman inside blinked rapidly, as if trying to process what was happening. Then, with great effort, she shifted slightly, her body stiff from being crammed inside the suitcase for who knew how long. The officer quickly unzipped the bag completely, helping her sit up. She was shaking, her face pale and covered in sweat. "We need medics here now," the officer called over his shoulder. His partner grabbed his radio, relaying the urgency of the situation. Max sniffed the woman, his tail low. His ears still perked as if he wasn't entirely sure the danger was over. The officer looked her in the eyes. "You're safe now. Can you tell us your name?" For a moment she didn't answer. Her eyes darted around the airport as if she was afraid someone was still watching her, someone she feared. Then in a weak voice she whispered, "Nadia." The name barely left her lips before her body wobbled, and she nearly collapsed forward. The officer caught her just in time, supporting her carefully. "Stay with me, Nadia. Help is coming." The crowd around them had grown, whispers spreading like wildfire. Was she kidnapped? Who would do something like this? How did no one notice? Meanwhile, the chase was still unfolding. The man who had run, the one who owned the suitcase, was darting through the airport, shoving past passengers, knocking over luggage carts, desperate to escape. The pursuing officer called for backup, weaving through the crowd, trying not to lose sight of him. The man turned sharply at the end of the terminal, heading toward an emergency exit. He reached for the door, but just before he could push through, another officer tackled him to the ground. He struggled, kicking and thrashing, but within seconds, handcuffs were locked around his wrists. "Let me go," he shouted, his voice filled with panic. "You don't understand." The officer, breathing heavily, tightened his grip. "Oh, I think we understand plenty." Back at the baggage claim, Nadia was still trembling. Paramedics had arrived and wrapped a blanket around her shoulders, checking her vitals. She clutched the fabric tightly as if afraid it would be taken from her. The officer crouched beside her. "Nadia, do you know the man who put you in the suitcase?" Her breath hitched. She looked at him, her lips trembling. "Yes," she whispered. The officer nodded, giving her space to continue. "Who is he?" She swallowed hard, glancing toward the direction where the man had run. "He's my brother." The officer's brows lifted slightly. That wasn't the answer he had expected. Max, still sitting beside them, let out a soft whine, sensing the tension in the air. Nadia's fingers gripped the blanket even tighter. "You don't understand," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "He wasn't trying to hurt me. He was trying to save me." The officer exchanged a look with his partner. This story was turning out to be far more complicated than it seemed. The man, Nadia's brother, was now being brought back toward them in handcuffs, his chest rising and falling with rapid breaths. When he saw Nadia sitting there, awake and speaking, his eyes filled with relief. "Nadia," he called out. "Are you okay?" She looked at him, her eyes brimming with emotions. The officer stepped between them. "You have a lot of explaining to do." The brother exhaled shakily. "I know," he said, nodding quickly. "I'll tell you everything. But please, just listen to me first." The tension in the airport was thick. The crowd watched in silence, waiting for the truth behind this bizarre and terrifying situation. The officers exchanged glances, then nodded. "Start talking," one of them said. And as the brother took a deep breath, ready to speak, The truth that was about to unfold would shock everyone even more than they already were. The airport security area was now surrounded by officers, paramedics, and curious passengers who couldn't look away from the unfolding scene. The man in handcuffs, Nadia's brother, shifted anxiously as he stood between two officers. His chest was rising and falling rapidly, his hands still slightly shaking despite being restrained. But his eyes never left Nadia. "Nadia," he said again, his voice softer this time, almost pleading. "Tell them." She hesitated. The blanket wrapped around her shoulders felt heavy, like the weight of everything she had been through was pressing down on her. Her lips parted, but no words came out. The officer standing beside her noticed her hesitation. "Take your time," he said gently. "We just need to understand what happened." Her brother clenched his fists. "They're coming," he muttered under his breath, his voice so low only the officer closest to him heard. The officer narrowed his eyes. "Who's coming?" Nadia swallowed hard. She knew exactly what her brother meant. Her fingers clutched at the edge of the blanket as she finally found the strength to speak. "You need to let him go," she whispered. The officers exchanged glances. "That's not how this works," one of them said. "We need answers first." Her brother shook his head, his voice filled with frustration. "We don't have time for answers." He turned back to Nadia, urgency in his eyes. "Did anyone follow us? Did you see them?" Nadia looked past the crowd, scanning the busy terminal. Her heart pounded. She didn't see anything unusual, just tired travelers, flight announcements flashing across digital screens, families reuniting. But that didn't mean they weren't there. "I don't know," she whispered. The officer nearest to them folded his arms. "You keep saying someone is after you, but we need more than that. Why was your sister in a suitcase? Why were you running?" Nadia's brother exhaled sharply, his body tense. He glanced around as if making sure no one was listening too closely. Then, with lowered voice, he said, "Because that was the only way to get her out of the country without them finding her." The words sent a chill through the air. One of the officers frowned. "Who?" He hesitated, as if saying it out loud would make it real. Then, in a voice filled with both fear and frustration, he said, "The people who own her." Cold silence followed. The officers exchanged uncertain glances, their expressions shifting from suspicion to something more serious. Nadia closed her eyes, her breathing uneven. She had hoped she would never have to explain this to anyone. But now there was no way around it. She looked up at the officer who had helped her out of the suitcase. "They won't stop looking," she said quietly. "They don't let people go." The weight of her words hung in the air. The officers were no longer just dealing with an unusual airport incident. This was something deeper, something far more dangerous. One of the officers radioed for reinforcements. They needed more security, more eyes on every entrance and exit. If what these siblings were saying was true, they had just stumbled into something much bigger than an abandoned suitcase. A few feet away, Max sat quietly, his ears twitching as if he could sense the lingering danger. His handler gave him a reassuring pat but kept his own eyes scanning the terminal, now hyper-aware of every unfamiliar face passing by. Then something shifted. Nadia stiffened suddenly, her eyes locking onto a man at the far end of the terminal. He wasn't doing anything outwardly suspicious, just standing there near the information desk, flipping through a newspaper. But something about him made her stomach twist. The way he held the paper too stiffly. The way he didn't glance around like a normal traveler. And then, as if he could feel her gaze, he slowly lowered the newspaper. Their eyes met. Nadia's blood ran cold. Her brother saw the change in her expression immediately. He followed her gaze, his entire body tensing the moment he spotted the man. "It's them," he breathed. The officer closest to him snapped his attention toward the man in question. "Stay here," he ordered, signaling to another officer before stepping forward. But the moment the officer moved, the man by the information desk calmly folded the newspaper, turned, and disappeared into the crowd. "We need eyes on that guy now," the officer barked into his radio. Several officers rushed in different directions, scanning the terminal. But in a place this big, with so many people moving in and out, losing one man in a crowd wasn't hard. Nadia's fingers gripped the edges of her blanket again. "He saw me," she whispered. Her brother exhaled sharply, his shoulders rigid. "This isn't over." The officer in charge of the scene turned back to them. "We need to get you both somewhere safe." Her brother looked at Nadia, then back at the officer. "Safe isn't an option," he said. "Not with them." The tension in the air was suffocating. No one knew exactly who they were, but the fear in these siblings' eyes was enough to make it clear. This wasn't just paranoia. This was real. And somewhere, hidden in the moving crowd of the airport, the people they were running from were still watching, waiting. Nadia knew one thing for certain. She wasn't free yet. The airport no longer felt like a busy transit hub. It felt like a trap. The officers had moved Nadia and her brother to a more secure area near the security checkpoint. But even there, the air felt thick with danger. Every passing traveler looked like a potential threat. Every movement in the crowd made Nadia flinch. The officer who had unzipped the suitcase crouched beside her again. "We've increased security. No one's getting near you," he assured her. His voice was steady, but his eyes flickered with concern. He could tell she didn't believe him. Nadia's brother, still in handcuffs, was tense, his jaw tight. "You don't understand," he said. "They don't have to get near us. They just have to watch." The officer glanced at the others standing guard. "Who are they?" he asked again. Neither of the siblings answered right away. Nadia's fingers trembled as she pushed a strand of hair behind her ear. "People," she whispered. "People with power. The kind you can't escape from." Her brother exhaled sharply. "They don't just let people leave." He looked the officer dead in the eyes. "We weren't supposed to make it this far." A silence stretched between them. The officer processed the weight of those words, realizing just how desperate this situation was. Then, through the radio on his shoulder, another officer's voice crackled through. "Suspect lost in the crowd. We're scanning security footage now." Nadia's stomach twisted. He was still out there. The man with the newspaper. Watching. Waiting. Max, the police dog, shifted beside his handler, ears twitching. His nose flared as if sensing something the humans couldn't. Then out of nowhere he growled. "Whoa." Warning. Nadia felt her heartbeat slam against her ribs. One of the officers followed Max's gaze. Across the terminal, past the metal detectors, a figure stood just outside the glass doors. He wasn't moving. He wasn't rushing like the other travelers. He was just standing. The same man. The one from before. But this time he wasn't alone. 3 others stood near him. Not talking, not looking at a phone, just waiting. The officer cursed under his breath. "We need to move them." Nadia's brother yanked against his cuffs. "Take them off," he demanded. "I can't protect her like this." One of the officers hesitated. "You're still in custody." But then Max barked loud and sharp. The officers turned back toward the glass doors. The men were gone. The officer grabbed his radio again. "We need immediate surveillance at all exits. Now." Nadia felt her breath shaking as she turned to her brother. "They know where we are." He nodded, his expression grim. "They always do." The officer in charge made a quick decision. "We're taking them to a secure location," he told his team. "Right now." 2 officers stepped closer to flank Nadia and her brother, guiding them quickly toward a restricted area of the airport. But even as they moved, she could feel it. That creeping sensation of eyes watching. She glanced over her shoulder. And that's when she saw it. A figure moving quickly through the crowd, heading straight for them. Nadia's heart nearly stopped. "They're here," she whispered. Her brother twisted his head, spotting the movement. "Go," he urged the officers. "Now." The officers reacted instantly, pushing them forward. Max barked again, straining against his leash. Footsteps pounded behind them. Someone was coming. And this time there was no more running. The footsteps behind them were fast. Too fast. Nadia's pulse pounded as the officers tightened their formation around her and her brother, pushing forward. The hallway they were moving through was narrow, leading toward a staff-only security exit. But the space also meant one thing. Whoever was chasing them was gaining ground. Max barked sharply, his body tense, ears forward. The officer holding his leash knew the dog sensed something urgent. He turned his head just in time to see a dark blur moving in from the side. A man dressed like an airport worker, but something was off. His badge was turned backward, and the moment their eyes met, the man reached into his jacket. "Down!" the officer shouted. Everything exploded into motion. The officers shoved Nadia and her brother forward as Max lunged, teeth bared, knocking the fake worker off balance. A loud crash echoed as they hit the ground, Max snapping at his arm, preventing him from grabbing whatever was inside his jacket. But that wasn't the worst part. From the other side of the terminal, 2 more figures had broken from the crowd. They weren't running wildly like the first pursuer. They were moving with chilling precision, their eyes locked on Nadia. "There's more of them," an officer yelled. Nadia felt the air squeeze out of her lungs. They weren't going to make it to the exit. The security checkpoint ahead was still too far. The officers around her drew their weapons, but firing inside a packed airport wasn't an option. They had to keep moving. Her brother acted before anyone else did. In one swift motion, he twisted his body, forcing his still cuffed hands under his legs so they were in front of him. Then, without hesitation, he grabbed the nearest officer's belt and yanked a key free. "Wait," the officer started, but her brother had already unlocked the cuffs and tossed them aside. Then he grabbed Nadia's hand. "Come on." She didn't think. She just ran. The officers scrambled to keep up, trying to cover them, but the figures behind them weren't slowing. They were closing in fast, and Nadia knew, if they got caught now, they were never getting out. They turned a sharp corner and found themselves in a maintenance corridor, a long, empty hallway lined with unmarked doors. No passengers, no cameras, no help. Her brother skidded to a stop, looking around frantically. Then his eyes locked onto a door marked "Authorized Person Only." He yanked it open. Inside was a staircase leading downward. "We don't even know where that goes." Nadia gasped. Her brother pulled her inside anyway. Anywhere but here. The door swung shut behind them just as they heard footsteps pounding against the tile. The chase wasn't over. It was just beginning. The stairwell was cold, the air thick with dust and the faint scent of cleaning chemicals. Nadia's breathing was ragged as she followed her brother down, her legs burning with every step. Behind them, the sound of the heavy door swinging open sent a jolt of panic through her. Their pursuers weren't far. Her brother pulled her forward. Faster! They hit the bottom of the stairs, finding themselves in a dimly lit underground passage. Pipes ran along the ceiling, and a dull hum of machinery echoed through the walls. It was some kind of service tunnel, stretching into darkness in both directions. Her brother hesitated, eyes scanning the space. Left or right? Nadia didn't know. Neither choice felt safe. But before she could decide, a voice called from behind them. "Stop running. You know there's nowhere left to go." Nadia's stomach twisted. She recognized that voice. Slowly she turned. One of the men stood at the top of the staircase, staring down at them with eerie calmness. He wasn't out of breath. He wasn't angry. He looked like he knew exactly how this would end. Her brother stepped protectively in front of her. "We're not going back." The man sighed, tilting his head. "You were never supposed to leave in the first place." Nadia clenched her fists. "You don't own me." A slow, knowing smile crept across the man's face. "Don't we?" He shuddered. The weight of those words felt suffocating, a reminder of everything she thought she had escaped. Her brother moved first. He grabbed a loose pipe from the floor and hurled it toward the man. The split second of distraction was all they needed. Run! They bolted down the left tunnel, their footsteps echoing loudly. The passage twisted and turned, but there was no exit in sight. The fear in Nadia's chest grew heavier with every step. Then up ahead, light door. Her brother reached it first, yanking the handle. Nadia spun around, panic rising. The tunnel behind them was empty, but she knew they were being hunted. What do we do? Her brother's eyes darted around, searching for another way out. Then he spotted it, a vent just wide enough for them to squeeze through. He pried it open, lifting Nadia toward the opening. Go! She scrambled inside, crawling through the tight metal space, her heart racing. Behind her, she heard footsteps approaching fast. Her brother was right behind her. A hand grabbed his ankle. Nadia twisted, her eyes wide with horror. The man had caught up. He held her brother tightly, his grip unyielding. Her brother kicked, struggling, but the man was too strong. Then, out of nowhere, barking. The police dog's growl echoed through the tunnel before he lunged. The man barely had time to react before Max clamped onto his arm, dragging him backward with a force that made Nadia's stomach drop. Two officers rushed in behind him, weapons drawn. Don't move, one of them shouted. Her brother yanked his leg free and scrambled into the vent after Nadia. They kept moving, forcing themselves forward until the vent led to another grate. Nadia kicked it open, tumbling out onto a polished floor. When she looked up, she realized where they were. The baggage claim. People were everywhere. Families, travelers, security guards. They had made it. Her brother dropped down beside her, both of them gasping for breath. Behind them, the sounds of struggle continued in the tunnel. Then a new voice spoke. Familiar one. Looks like we got here just in time. Nadia turned to see the officer who had helped her earlier. He stood with his team, Max at his side, watching as more officers secured the area. Her brother exhaled, collapsing against the floor. Took you long enough. The officer smirked. You weren't exactly easy to track. Nadia felt the weight of the moment settle over her. They were safe. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't running. But then, just as relief washed over her, something shifted. She looked past the officer, scanning the crowd. Something was wrong. One of the men who had been chasing them was gone. She felt the hairs on her arms rise. This wasn't over. Nadia's chest tightened as her eyes swept the baggage claim area. The officers were busy securing the man they had caught, but she knew one was missing. The realization sent a shiver through her. Her brother, still catching his breath beside her, followed her gaze and stiffened. He had noticed it too. The officer in charge was speaking into his radio, calling for more backup, but Nadia barely heard him. The crowds moved around them, travelers unaware of the danger that had just unfolded beneath their feet. It was almost eerie, the way life in the airport continued as if nothing had happened. As if she and her brother hadn't just barely escaped something terrible. Then she saw him. Near the exit doors, blending into a group of passengers, the last man, the one who had been leading the chase. He was walking away, his posture calm, controlled, as if this had all been just another job for him. He didn't turn back. He didn't need to. Nadia's heart pounded. Should she yell? Should she run after him? But as she took a shaky step forward, her brother placed a firm hand on her shoulder. Let him go, he murmured. She turned to him, disbelief flashing in her eyes. He'll come back. Her brother's face was grim. Maybe. But not today. The officer finally noticed their tension and followed their gaze. By the time he locked onto the figure near the doors, it was too late. The man had already disappeared into the sea of travelers. The officer cursed under his breath and signaled for one of his men to follow. But Nadia knew it wouldn't matter. The man was a ghost. He had done this before. He knew how to vanish. Max let out a quiet, low growl beside her. The dog still sensed it, the unfinished danger lingering in the air. But then the officer sighed and turned back to them. You two need to come with us. There's a lot we need to go over. Nadia and her brother exchanged a look. They had known this was coming. There would be questions, so many questions. Who were they running from? Why had those men been after them? What was inside that suitcase? She took a deep breath. Maybe it was time to finally tell the truth. The next few hours passed in a blur. They were taken to a secure room in the airport, away from the public, where investigators asked them everything. At first, Nadia hesitated, worried that speaking up would only make things worse. But with her brother beside her, she knew they couldn't keep running forever. So they told their story. They had been part of something they never asked for, something dangerous. A network of people who operated in the shadows, controlling lives, deciding who could leave and who couldn't. Nadia and her brother had grown up surrounded by it, trapped by people who made sure they never had a choice. But they had found a way out. Or at least they thought they had. That suitcase at the airport. It was never theirs. It had been planted. Message. A warning. A way to remind them that no matter how far they ran, they would always be within reach. The officers listened carefully, exchanging glances as Nadia and her brother spoke. When they finished, there was a long silence. Then, finally, one of the higher-ranking officers leaned forward. You understand that this isn't over, right? Nadia swallowed hard. I know. Her brother clenched his fists. But we're done being afraid. The officer studied them for a moment, then nodded. We'll do what we can to keep you safe. But people like this, they don't just stop. Nadia already knew that. She had felt it in her bones the moment she saw that last man walk away. This wasn't a fight that ended today. But maybe, just maybe, it was the beginning of something different. After hours of questioning, they were finally allowed to leave. An officer escorted them through a back exit of the airport, away from prying eyes. Max walked beside them until the very last moment, his sharp, intelligent eyes watching as they stepped outside. For the first time in what felt like forever, Nadia breathed in the night air. Smelled fresh. Clean. Her brother stretched his arms. So, what now? Nadia glanced up at the sky. The city lights flickered in the distance, and for the first time in a long time, she realized they had something they never had before. Ois. We start over, she said softly. Her brother smirked. You make it sound easy. She gave a small, tired laugh. It won't be. But it would be worth it. As they walked away from the airport, Nadia didn't look back. She knew their past wasn't done with them. She knew there were still shadows waiting. But for now they were free. And that was enough.